here is the weird story. What if MK is actually funded by the Russian intelligence services? Yes, I know it sounds a bit far-fetched, but just bear with me. In an article written by Andrei Pinar, who is very well regarded, Pinar suggests that perhaps MK is being funded by the Russians because Cyril Ramaphosa is not allowing the Russian African strategy to materialize. Because basically he's screwing up the country, he's losing support, and therefore the Russian strategy for Africa is not going to happen if the ANC lose power in this particular country. So I've linked the article in the description below, but essentially what it states is that number one, Putin brokered a peace deal between Cyril Ramaphosa and Jacob Zuma on the auspices that Jacob Zuma will go back to Nkandla and just retire in peace. Meanwhile, after the fact, Putin said, fuck you, Cyril, here is money for MK, and we're going to make sure that MK is sort of there to bolster the ANC to make sure that there are interests of the Russian people right here in South Africa through the MK party and Jacob Zuma. And Byron, I know you as a lib might think this is very far-fetched, but never, ever, ever forget. Jacob Zuma has been funded by the Russians since time immemorial.
That's a great defense of being called a lib. Christian nationalist, I'll accept that. Lib, jeez, why are you insulting me? Anyway, if we actually look at this, it actually makes sense, because if you look at the South Atlantic corridor, yeah, that's a bit of a problem at the moment. And what we do know is that the actual cape around the Cape of Good Hope, the ability to travel around there, that's actually now going to become a very major waterway in the future. So actually South Africa does carry a very important role going forward because of the Cape of Good Hope. Now, the Americans obviously want a stranglehold in South Africa because it means that they can secure their interests, and so do the Russians, because as we have seen, we're back to the 50s and we're back to two superpowers fighting it out. But what I suppose is interesting, Ramon, is that the idea that Jacob Zuma came back to political life appears, according to this article, to actually be a Russian ploy. And what the article basically claims is that the Russians are funding the MK movement. Now, a lot of people have looked at the MK movement and noted it appears to be a party with a shitload of funds, considering it basically just started. And a lot of people have asked, well, where did the cash come from? I mean, you could argue it just came from Cyril's couch. Maybe he just raided that. But it would appear, according to this article, that the actual money has come from the Kremlin, because what the Kremlin's doing, according to this article, is basically bolstering up his South African support so that South Africa can become a vassal state of Russia. What's your view on that?
I actually think this is good news. Now, I know I'm going to get hate in the comments down below, but just hear me out, right? We know for a fact that South Africa is infested by Western-funded NGOs. George Soros funds 140 to 160 different NGOs in this place, and they have come up with the most bullshit policies that have been adopted by both the DA and the ANC. Minimum wage laws, basic income grants, and most importantly, the NHI and the limitation of gun rights. These all come from NGOs funded by Western backers. South Africa has always been a laboratory for the West through these NGOs, just like the Ukraine has become in Eastern Europe. So in this particular case, for the very first time, Russia has a stake at this table. Russia understands quite well South Africa is important for various ways, geopolitical and otherwise, and Cyril is not to be trusted because he can be bought over by the green energy agenda of the West, and therefore the only solution and the only respite for Russian interests in this country is through Jacob Zuma, who speaks Russian fluently, who was trained by Russia, and has often been accused of being a legitimate Russian spy. All those things are probably true, and I have no doubt that MK is funded by Russia. So what does this mean, Byron, for South Africa? How do you feel about the fact that one of the greatest opponents of the ANC is ironically Russian funded?
So clearly, the Russian interests of having their state basically be a proxy of another, having the globalization hegemony where everything becomes uniform, isn't really in the Russian psyche, and nor in the Chinese psyche at the moment. And so these individuals are very anti this type of propaganda. But this type of propaganda is deeply enabled in the West. We see it in England, we see it in America, and we certainly see it in the European Union. So I suppose it stands to reason, Ramon, that if we don't want to be part of the, let's call it the global dumbing down and communist ploy, that possibly having Russia or China involved in South Africa, contrary to popular belief, may actually be a good thing, I suppose.
It could actually be a good thing because Russia is is a sort of, a gangster traditional state, for the lack of a better term. So is China. It's fairly traditional. They've banned wokeism for the most part. They've banned like girly men from TV. They've banned video games for like 24 hours a day. Like these are countries, they're not liberal countries. And I think that's very important. I think the attempt to make South Africa a liberal country has completely destroyed it. And the attempt has been made by the West to do it. The West funds all sorts of nonsense in Africa generally and in South Africa in particular. That is bullshit. That has destroyed the family. That has destroyed a variety of things. The ANC is a useful idiot of the West. They are also to blame. But in this particular regard, Russia had to make a stand. The South African strategy and the African strategy for Russia is important to them. They can't trust Cyril, so therefore they are giving their money to MK. So we actually got literal Russian interference in our elections right here in South Africa, only because we've had American interference and British interference since like 1910. So it's about time we sort of equalize these sort of things. Ironically, MK is giving the ANC heart attacks, especially in KZN predominantly. So far, it seems to be a good strategy for Russia. I mean, let's see how it works out. I know a lot of people are going to be really pissed, but what else is Russia to do if they can't trust Cyril Ramaphosa?
Yeah, I think the anti-globalist agenda of Russia at the moment is actually a very interesting ploy because obviously Soros, we picking on Soros because why not? He is one of the big drivers of globalism. He says that according to him, civilization will not survive the Ukraine war, especially if Ukraine loses to Russia. And the reason he says that is because, according to him, the Russians aren't civilized. You see, civilization means this kind of like complete woke, liberal, extremely left wing agenda. Like, if you're not doing that, then you're not civilized. And I suppose to a large degree, that idea does permeate South Africa. We tend to think to ourselves, if we align with places like Russia or China, what we'll be left with is I don't know, a less than civilization. Because, in most individuals' psyche, Africa can't be civilized without the influence of the West. And I can see why people would hate us for saying possibly siding with the Russians or the Chinese would be a good thing. But Ramon, do you really want wokeism infecting South African politics, especially given our history?
Well, I believe that we are the first woke country. Diversity, inclusion, equality, it's built into the constitution of this country. Since 1994, we've had, BE and affirmative action, and the hairstyles of black ladies in schools is very important, and all that bullshit. We are the first woke country, and everyone else is learning from us. But ironically, the one who isn't woke is actually Jacob Zuma. Because let's look at some of the stuff he wants to say. Over the weekend, he spoke about some of the promises that MK wants to do, and they're not what you would expect them to be, Byrons. I'll point them out. Teenage pregnancy won't be allowed by law. They will build a university on Robben Island and send all pregnant teenagers to Robben Island to attend school there. That's pretty based. And a unique
Very interesting.
policy. Number two, MK will introduce corporal punishment at schools. No child will be able to call the police on their parents. And he also wants to do away with Roman Dutch law because it's an imposition from the West. Weird. Not sure if I agree or disagree, but at least there are policies that are a bit unique. And then, of course, MK will provide free education for everyone. But you can see the sort of conservative nature of Jacob Zuma coming out in those particular policies. So he's going to be very right wing on sort of cultural things and very left wing on economics, like a national socialist. We've had that before. It worked well, sort of, in this country. Maybe we need to return to that, which is basically what Russia is saying, I would think.
Yeah, but I hear you being said national socialism has been tried before somewhere else in the world before, Ramon, and it resulted in the ethnic cleansing of an entire race. And I suppose what everybody fears in South Africa is if the MK party were to ever have political power, that it would restore some kind of like, I suppose, customary law. I mean, we've already seen this in certain, should we say, utterances of certain politicians, and certainly certain high court judges at the moment have uttered about this customary law, tribal law. bit like Sharia law, but I suppose a local version of it. And possibly by having that National Socialist, that might lead to the genocide of another minority race in South Africa. And that is obviously the fear that most people live with. But what we can say, from all of this being said, is at least the MK party, as you rightly say, does actually have unique policies. And that in itself must show that the party itself is not typically aligned to the usual, should we say, political paradigm. The idea, the ideas that it espouses are typically unique. What we see with the other mainstream political parties is that it's pretty much of a muchness, isn't it?
Well, I think that we can differentiate between National Socialism and like the Holocaust, because there are a lot of things that are nationally socialist. Apartheid is an example of that to some extent. Common Day Singapore is another example of that. Uh, Russia, to some extent, is also a sort of national socialist. It's basically being right wing on culture and left wing on economics. It doesn't denote like genocide against Jews. So I just want to differentiate. It's not Nazism. It's existed before Nazism and existed after Nazism. Nazism is an example of National Socialism, but not the only one. And I think MK wants this idea of National Socialism, closed borders for South Africans, send teenage girls to Robben Island, like in the good old days. And yeah, unlike Julius Malema, who wants open borders and socialism, which is a traditional communist take. It's communism for the world, not just for your country. MK is socialism for our country, but nationally ordained.
Yeah, and I can get that. But obviously, when we use certain key phrases, it does trigger certain people's psyche and specifically certain people's worries. And I can understand why certain individuals would have that worry in South Africa, given the utterances of some political leaders, like the commander in chief of the EFF. We know what he all has to say about minority groups in South Africa. But that being said, Ramon, still a very interesting idea. It appears, according to this article, that the MK party is nothing more than a Russian front. It appears that they are claiming that the Russians funded the creation of the party, and that to a large degree, a lot of the political orders by that party, as an example, the return of Jacob Zuma to the political arena, has been ordered by the Kremlin himself. Very interesting ideas to see, should we say, former colonial powers back in Africa fighting it over the African soil. It's nice to see that in 2024, we're pretty much back to the 1920s and the colonial fight over African soil.